The cabin was small and unassuming, nestled deep within the woods of upstate New York. It had been John Crow's idea to take the trip, though he hadn't expected his friends to actually agree. After years of serving in the Army, John had developed a fondness for quiet places, somewhere he could put out the constant thrum of chaos. And these woods, with their canopy of autumn leaves and crisp, cool air, seemed the perfect getaway. His friends, Mark, a computer programmer, Sarah, an avid outdoors woman, and Ethan, the life of the party, had all joined him. They'd driven up from different corners of the country, converging in this remote spot for a much-needed break. The weather was cloudy when they arrived, a faint gray haze diffusing the sunlight, adding an eerie cast to the surrounding forest. John had spent his childhood in Mississippi, where he'd learned how to hunt, fish, and move quietly through the woods. Those lessons felt distant now, but they lingered in his muscle memory, surfacing every so often as a quiet confidence when he navigated unfamiliar terrain. The first day passed uneventfully. They unpacked supplies, cooked over an old wood stove, and laughed around a small fire they built outside. John enjoyed the camaraderie, even as a nagging unease took root in his gut. The woods were too quiet. He'd been in places like this before, dense and sprawling, where danger could slip between the trees without a sound. It was on the second evening that everything changed. They'd gone hiking earlier in the day, exploring a narrow trail that twisted deeper into the forest. By the time they returned to the cabin, the clouds had thickened, casting the woods into premature dusk. Ethan suggested another fire, and they all agreed. As the flames flickered, John caught himself glancing over his shoulder more than once. It wasn't just the quiet now. There was a sense of being watched, an almost tangible presence just beyond the light. He said nothing, not wanting to spook the others. Then they heard it, a faint rustling just beyond the tree line. Probably an animal, Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. John stood, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. "Stay here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He moved toward the sound, his footsteps deliberate and silent on the soft forest floor. The rustling stopped. John scanned the trees, his senses sharp. At first he saw nothing, but then his eyes locked onto something. A shape, tall and thin, partially obscured by the trunk of a large oak. It wasn't an animal. Its silhouette was human-like, but wrong. The limbs were too long, the proportions off, as if someone had stretched a person like taffy. "Who's there?" John called, his voice steady. The figure didn't move, but he could feel its gaze. The air seemed to thicken, and a chill ran down his spine. He stepped back, his instincts screaming at him to retreat. "Get inside," he said as he reached the others. "What was it?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "I don't know," John admitted. He wasn't one to scare easily, but there was something deeply unsettling about that figure. The rest of the night was tense. They stayed by the fire, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. At one point, Mark swore he saw movement in the shadows, but when John shone a flashlight, there was nothing there. They heard the first scream just before dawn. It came from the woods, a high-pitched, guttural sound that sent a shiver through them all. Before they could react, the creature lunged from the darkness, its pale form illuminated briefly by the firelight. It moved with unnatural speed, swiping at Ethan and knocking him to the ground. John sprang into action, slashing at the creature with his knife. It recoiled, emitting a sound that was more growl than scream before disappearing into the trees. "Ethan's hurt," Sarah said, kneeling beside him. His arm was bleeding, the wound deep but not life-threatening. "We need to move," John said. "It's not going to stop." They gathered what they could carry and left the cabin, sticking close together as they moved through the forest. John took the lead, his senses on high alert. The clouds above blocked out the moonlight, making it difficult to see. Every so often, John caught a glimpse of the creature, just a flicker of movement in the corner of his vision. It was stalking them, staying just far enough away to avoid another confrontation. They didn't stop, not even when Ethan stumbled and nearly fell. John's training kicked in, keeping him focused on the goal, the nearby village they'd passed on their way to the cabin. It was miles away, but it was their only chance. The creature attacked again when they were halfway there. This time, it targeted Mark, slashing at his back before John managed to drive it off. Mark could still walk, but barely. They finally emerged from the woods just as dawn broke, the village's small collection of houses visible in the distance. The creature didn't follow them out of the forest, stopping at the edge of the trees and watching as they stumbled into safety. The villagers didn't believe their story. They chalked it up to a bear attack and warned them not to venture into the woods again. John didn't argue. He'd seen enough to know that what they encountered wasn't a bear. It wasn't human either. As they sat in a diner later that morning, nursing cups of coffee and trying to process what had happened, John's thoughts drifted to his family. His father had always told him stories about creatures that lived in the wild, but he'd never believed them. Now he wasn't so sure. The drive through Montana in winter was a sight to behold. Wide open plains cloaked in white, mountains rising in the distance like watchful sentinels. Nick Calhoun had always loved fishing, and when the opportunity arose to take a trip to one of the state's famed rivers, he hadn't hesitated. Winter wasn't the typical season for fishing, but he liked the quiet it brought. Fewer people, fewer distractions. Just the sound of the river and the cold air biting at his face. Nick was from Austin, where the winters were milder and life never seemed to stop moving. He worked as an IT specialist, glued to a desk most days, troubleshooting systems for clients who didn't understand technology but demanded its flawless operation. This trip was a break from the screens and the endless buzz of the city. The cabin he rented was on the edge of a wooded area, with the river just a short walk away. Snow blanketed everything, muffling sound and creating an almost otherworldly stillness. Nick spent the first day setting up, organizing his gear, and testing the frozen waters. The fish were sluggish but catchable. That night, as he sat by the fire outside the cabin, he couldn't shake a strange feeling, like he wasn't alone. The woods seemed darker than they should have been, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. He tried to brush it off as paranoia. After all, he'd read about the region's folklore, its tales of strange creatures lurking in the wilderness. Skinwalkers, the legends called them. Shapeshifters that mimicked voices and wore the faces of things they weren't. He'd chalked it up to local superstition, the kind of thing people told around campfires. But then he heard the sound. At first it was faint, a rustling in the trees, like an animal moving through the underbrush. Nick tensed, his grip tightening on the flashlight in his hand. The rustling grew louder, closer. He shone the beam toward the noise, but it revealed nothing but swaying branches. Then came the cry. It was high-pitched and guttural, like a scream that didn't belong to any animal he'd ever heard. It echoed through the forest, sending a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Nick backed toward the cabin, his eyes scanning the woods for movement. Probably a wolf, he muttered to himself, though he didn't believe it. Wolves didn't scream like that. The next day, he returned to the river. The sun was hidden behind a thick layer of gray clouds, and snow began to fall in soft, steady flakes. He couldn't shake the unease from the night before, but he pushed through it. The water was cold enough to sting his fingers, and the fish were more elusive than the day prior. As he worked, he felt it again, that sense of being watched. He turned sharply, scanning the tree line. For a moment, he saw nothing, but then his eyes locked onto something, a figure partially hidden behind a tree. It looked human, but there was something wrong about it. Its limbs were too thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Nick froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Hey!" he called, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. Nick grabbed his fishing knife, his pulse pounding in his ears. The figure stepped out from behind the tree, revealing its full form. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tightly over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to suck in the light around them. Nick didn't wait to see what it would do. He bolted for the cabin, his boots crunching through the snow. He could hear it following him, its footsteps unnaturally fast, closing the distance with every second. He slammed the door shut behind him, locking it and shoving a chair under the knob for good measure. The creature screamed again, the sound reverberating through the cabin walls. That night was hell. Nick stayed awake by the fire, clutching his knife and listening to the creature's movements outside. It circled the cabin, its heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. Occasionally it scratched at the walls, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. He thought of his family, his dad, who had taught him how to fish, and his mom, who always packed him extra food for his trips, saying, "Just in case." He wished he'd called them before he'd left, just to hear their voices. As the hours dragged on, Nick formulated a plan. He couldn't stay here. He had to make a run for it. There was a small town a few miles away. If he could make it there, he'd be safe. At first light, he packed his gear as quietly as possible, not wanting to alert the creature. The snow was still falling, muffling his footsteps as he slipped out the back door. The woods were eerily silent. Nick moved quickly but cautiously, his knife at the ready. He could see tracks in the snow, long, narrow prints that didn't belong to any animal he recognized. He didn't make it far before the creature attacked. It came out of nowhere, its skeletal form lunging at him with a guttural growl. Nick managed to slash at it with his knife, the blade slicing into its arm. It screamed, a horrible, unearthly sound, and retreated into the trees. Nick didn't stop. He ran, his legs burning and his lungs aching from the cold air. The town was closer now, the faint outlines of buildings visible through the trees. When he finally stumbled into the town, he collapsed on the steps of a diner. The locals rushed to help him, their faces a mix of concern and disbelief as he tried to explain what had happened. The police didn't believe him, of course. They said it was probably a bear or a coyote, but Nick knew better. He'd seen the creature, heard it scream. As he sat in the warmth of the diner, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to steady his hands, he thought about the stories he'd read. They weren't just folklore. Some things in the woods were real. The sun hung low in the clear winter sky as Viggo Davidson adjusted his jacket, stepping out of the car to inspect the situation. The engine had sputtered one last protest before falling silent, and now the vehicle was as lifeless as the frosty landscape surrounding them. The road stretched out in both directions, bordered by dense Maine woods cloaked in snow. It had been sunny earlier in the day, the brightness reflecting off the endless white, but now shadows crept long and sharp as the afternoon waned. Viggo's breath plumed in front of him as he leaned under the hood. "Looks like we're stuck," he said, his tones steady but inwardly calculating. As a soldier, Viggo had been in far worse predicaments, but there was something unsettling about being stranded in the middle of nowhere with night coming on. He glanced back at his companions. Jenna, the sharp-witted engineer, Craig, an overly optimistic college buddy who'd convinced them to take the scenic route, and Leah, Craig's younger sister, quieter but practical. They all stood bundled against the cold, looking at him for answers. "We're not getting this running without parts," Viggo said finally, shutting the hood with a soft thud. "Can we call for help?" Leah asked. "No signal," Jenna said, holding up her phone. "We're officially off the grid." "Well, we could wait it out," Craig suggested. "The weather's clear. Someone's bound to drive by." "Not likely on this road," Viggo replied, scanning the tree line. "And we don't have time to waste before dark. Let's find somewhere to hunker down." The group gathered their essentials, flashlights, blankets, some food, and headed into the woods. Viggo's gaze lingered on the car for a moment. Something about the quietness of the area felt wrong, as if the silence wasn't natural but imposed. They walked for nearly an hour before they found a small clearing. In its center stood the remnants of an old hunting cabin, weathered but sturdy enough to provide some shelter. By nightfall, they had a fire going in the cabin's crumbling stone fireplace. The warmth was a relief, but the isolation of the woods pressed in on them. Shadows flickered across the walls, and the wind carried faint creaks and rustles that set everyone on edge. Viggo sat close to the fire, sharpening the blade of his pocket knife. His mind wandered to his family back in Texas. He thought of his younger brother, whose antics always brought laughter to the house, and his mother, who'd raised him with a grit that had carried him through countless challenges. She always said, "You're tougher than the worst of it." He repeated that to himself now. The first sound came just after midnight. It was faint at first, a shuffle of movement outside the cabin. Viggo's hands stilled and he glanced at the others. Jenna had heard it too, her eyes darting toward the door. Craig was about to speak when a sharp, deliberate scratching noise echoed against the wall. Leah gasped, clutching her blanket tighter. Viggo motioned for silence, rising slowly to peer out a crack in the door. The moon cast an eerie glow across the snowy clearing, but nothing moved, just trees and shadows. Yet, the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. "Anything?" Jenna whispered. Viggo shook his head, but kept his voice low. "Stay close to the fire." Hours later, as the fire dwindled, Viggo sat watch while the others dozed fitfully. That's when he saw it, movement just beyond the tree line. His muscles tensed as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. The figure was humanoid, but its posture was hunched, its limbs unnaturally long. It stood half concealed behind a tree, the faint glint of eyes catching the moonlight as it stared back at him. Viggo's pulse quickened. He'd read about this in his research, reports of a creature in Maine matching the descriptions of a werewolf. Hunters and hikers whispered of a beast that was neither man nor wolf, capable of intelligence and malice in equal measure. He didn't wake the others, not yet. Instead, he watched, his grip tightening on the knife. The figure moved again, slinking around the edge of the clearing. It wasn't coming closer, just circling, waiting. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the figure disappeared. Viggo woke the group, explaining what he'd seen without elaborating too much. They packed quickly, their breath fogging in the frigid air as they trudged back toward the road. They didn't make it far before the attack came. It happened fast, a blur of movement, a guttural snarl, and Craig was knocked to the ground. Viggo reacted instantly, slashing at the creature with his knife. It was fast and strong, its claws raking across his arm before retreating into the woods. Craig was injured but alive, his leg bleeding badly. Viggo hoisted him up, adrenaline dulling his own pain. They moved as quickly as they could, fear propelling them through the woods. Every sound set them on edge, the crunch of snow, the snap of a branch. The creature was following them, its growls echoing just out of sight. By the time they reached the main road, the sun was high in the sky. Viggo waved down the first vehicle they saw, a truck driver who didn't ask many questions as he helped them load Craig in the back. They never called the police. What would they say? That a werewolf had attacked them in the woods? No one would believe it. As they drove toward the nearest town, Viggo stared out the window, his arm bandaged with a strip of his jacket. The memory of those hollow eyes and that deliberate stalking would stay with him forever. Somewhere deep in the Maine woods, the creature still waited.